Okay, today I want to make a general brewing guide for a lot of the Asia Roasting Project coffees. This is probably going to be the last video that I put up on this channel regarding how to actually brew these coffees. The rest is actually going to go on our new YouTube channel specifically for the project. We're going to have a lot more in-depth videos from our roasters, how to brew their coffees, all of that, and that's coming soon to the YouTube channel. I also have a brand new coffee from Mojo Coffee that is released on the site. We're roasting very, very soon, but you can use the discount code MOJO for 10% off, but it's the final coffee that we're releasing for this year, and I am very, very excited about it. But today I want to kind of give you guys that very overall brewing methodology idea, tell you guys how I approach these coffees, and it's going to be quite similar to how we brew espresso and how we handle these coffees, which is, one is you can brew the coffee in a way that allows you to push for sweetness. I really, really enjoy all of these coffees when they are presented in a way that maximizes sweetness. Or what you can do is you can brew the coffees in a way that focuses on transparency, for example, larger ratios, using high clarity burr sets, that then will allow you to taste the profile and what the roaster is doing to the coffees in a more, I guess, a transparent way. So I put out that espresso brew guide, and a lot of you guys have enjoyed it, and I think you guys kind of are on the same page now, which is like you can push the coffees in a direction that allows you to, I would say, enjoy the style more, or even taste the coffees in a way that is, high clarity, that lets you taste the various profiles and how each roaster approaches acidity and integrating things like that into the shot. Very same kind of methodology that we're going to approach today with doing pour over. I also, again, want to stress that these coffees are pretty easy to brew. I don't really think these are coffees that need you to push extraction in a certain way. With our coffees, like, for example, Desolate and Mute and Face Up and Momokawa, all these coffees, I think they actually handle really well in that 20 to 22% range if you were to look at pure numbers. Of course, depends on what equipment and methodology you're doing and so on and so forth. And I think this is great for many of you guys because this means that you don't have to brew in a very meticulous way to make the coffee taste good, I guess, or also for you to enjoy the actual roasting profile. And I think even you could take the same exact pour-over recipe and apply them to all of our coffees, and you should be able to taste the difference in the roast profile and figure out what a roaster's thought process is when they are actually, brewing the coffee. But on the new YouTube channel, you will see all of the videos from each roaster on how to brew their coffee, but this is kind of this general approach that we're going to do today. Then we're going to do both approaches like we did in the espresso video. The first one is we are going to brew in a way that pushes for sweetness, and the second way is we're going to brew for transparency. So before I actually get brewing, I really need to tell you guys about temperature here. The temperature that I use for majority of these coffees is 92 Celsius. I actually really like these lower temperatures for our coffees, and the reason why is I really enjoy a rounded presentation for these coffees. Of course, you can push higher temperatures and experiment, but I like to start with a lower temperature just because I think it really rounds out the finish and boosts a lot of that sweetness and inherent property of sweetness in these coffees. So let's go ahead and actually do two example brews. The first brew is I'm going to do kind of this low agitation, push for sweetness type of pour over brew, which I think suits a lot of these coffees. And the second is I'm going to brew kind of how I brew a lot of these lighter roast coffees into a larger ratio, which I think pushes the coffees a bit, but allows you to really transparently taste what the roast profile is actually doing here. I like to start off and use 15 grams. I've recently been brewing lower dosages. I'm not gonna dive that nitty gritty into like which pour over dripper, which paper filter, all of that I'm using for this video. I think the biggest things that you can literally just take these two methodologies and apply them to whatever dripper you are using. Of course, each dripper will push the overall brew in a certain direction. For example, I think this V60, which I'm going to brew today, it's going to be like higher clarity on that acidity, whereas things like this Deep 27, it's kind of like cheat mode for making the overall brew very, very sweet. And then something like your flat bottom, even things like this UFO dripper, these guys will emphasize, I would say, loudness of the acidity and these flavor notes, which is sometimes good and bad depending on these coffees. I personally much prefer cone-shaped drippers with our coffee. Before we actually get brewing, and let me talk quickly about grinders. So if you're using something like this guy, and I kind of don't really want to throw out like random micron numbers right now, but basically push the grind on, like, definitely on the finer side, but not so fine that you would brew something like, you know, Say, or all these very lightly roasted coffees. Like, we're talking, these coffees are mostly medium lights, right? Maybe skewing actually towards the lighter side, but I think a lot of these coffees are quite easy to brew. You know, they're not insanely delicate in that way that requires you to push grind so fine in a way that the acidity and all of that will suddenly become very, very bitter, or, you know, astringent and all of that. So I actually like to go a little bit coarser than what you would go for some of these, you know, ultra lightly roasted wash coffees. Most of these coffees are pretty forgiving here, but really what's going to make a lot of this taste good is actually that lower temperature, and that's going to help, you know, round things out and all of that. You know, if you're using something like 98 flat, then definitely feel free to go finer, play around until you get to a point where you feel like the roast profile of the coffee is compromised or the brew is not so sweet anymore. So here is my 15 grams. My scale is going to run out of power, so hopefully it doesn't run out of power on camera. But I'm going to just do basically pouring at a I'm trying to pour at a pretty slow flow rate. And I have the camera up top here, so this is like a very new thing. So I'm actually going to bloom to 60. I'm going to just let this guy just sit here for about a minute. I think this is really what helps bring a lot of the sweetness in, is just this like very low agitation bloom at the beginning. But we're just going to brew to 255. So nothing too crazy here. Then I'm just going to pour up here. Of course, if I had the smaller V60, this would help a lot, but I'm keeping this very simple here. We're just going to pour up to 150. So it's basically like 60, 150, 250. A lot of this is not that complex, okay? And kind of about like 130 is when I do the next 100 gram pour. So I'm pouring pretty slow-ish flow rate, by the way. Hopefully the camera can see what I'm doing. Okay, and then you can do a little swirl and a little light tap. So I'm going to move this guy. Hopefully the camera can see it. But generally speaking, I think just that slower flow rate and slower flow rate and lower agitation and all of that, I think really helps emphasize a lot of the sweetness in these coffees. I'm not trying to push the coffees in a way with like wet WDT, at least in this example, because I think it can push a lot of the coffees to be, I would say, like out of the zone of what I envision them to taste. So this is wrapping up. Basically, this is an incredibly straightforward 3-pour technique, right? We do the larger-ish bloom, but it's at such a low agitation and for a longer time that I think it really helps extract a lot of these coffees. I think visually on some of these, especially some of the honey processed coffees and the naturals and all of that, they don't visually look the best when you're actually brewing them. And then the rest of the other pours are just basically lower agitation. I think low agitation with these coffees really, really boosts a lot of the sweetness, and we're not pushing the coffees in a direction that is, I would say, crazy here. So I'm brewing 15 to 250. That is not a very, very large ratio here, but because I'm using this lower temperature and that low agitation, relatively low agitation, I would say, I'm able to get a lot of sweetness out here. I think these coffees are pretty soluble and they're pretty easy to brew. They're not crazy where I have to go in and do crazy manual agitation and all of that. So feel free to play around with how large you do the bloom and also how much you pour in that second and even third pour. I think this style of brew is a good example of pushing sweetness and also letting the coffee carry the story in a little bit. There is acidity in here because we're still extracting, and because these coffees are, they're light, right? So there's still going to be acidity in here, but I still think that lower agitation and honestly the low kettle temperature, the lower like 90, 92 Celsius world, is rounding a lot of stuff out and pushing up a lot of sweetness. So it's like, yes, there is acidity, but it gets integrated into the rest of the brew, and overall everything is pretty sweet. This is kind of like my basic approach with how to brew all of these coffees. Some adjustments you could do is you actually don't need to do 3 different pours there. Or, if your dosage changes, what you could actually do is you could do that larger bloom. I think the reason why I still like to do this larger bloom and longer bloom is I still do want some sort of brightness in the coffee, but I want the rest of the brew to finish sweet. So essentially, like, yes, I want to bring in some acidity, but I want everything to kind of like, be integrated and rounded and all of that. Under 1:17 ratio, I think is a really great sweet spot for a lot of these coffees. The acidity is much more controlled because of that, lower agitation. So now let's brew the second version, which I think will let the profile shine more, but I will say that this is not how I recommend you fully brew these coffees. I just think it is fun to do and presents a very different style. Of all of the coffees we have now, I think the second style works best with Face Up and Mojo. So Face Up, I would say his profile is definitely more in line with what I think a lot of people, people who like brightness and acidity, people focus on that. I think his profile works really well for that. Otherwise, I still kind of veer towards that first way of brewing because I just want to taste sweetness. I think this is what makes a lot of these coffees very unique. For the second method, which focuses more on transparency, I would just take whatever grind size you have and go just slightly coarser here. And kind of that main reason why I want to go coarser is to compensate for the fact that we are going to push the ratio out there. So the cool thing here is we could actually brew this very traditionally, like we brew some of these ultra lightly roasted coffees, get in there, really, really push the coffees. But I think what actually makes these taste good is still kind of approach lower agitation, but play with the ratio larger. So we're gonna get a more, I would say, integrated, harmonious brew that is quite similar to if you were to actually cup these coffees. Feel free to actually cup these coffees. But we are going to take advantage of the fact that we are brewing low agitation, lower temperature, and we're not going to do as many pours as with the first recipe. I'm keeping the dosage the same here. So we're talking 1:17, 1:18, 1:19. I don't really enjoy these coffees at 1:20, but I do think they are pretty okay in 1:18, 1:19, but you need to do a lot of stuff to kind of, I would say, get rid of any sort of astringency. And I feel like at this point in time, we're brewing in like a very meticulous way, and it's quite annoying. It's not as fun to brew. If I mess up, I can end up hitting a lot of bitterness and astringency, and it's not as fun. But I do think this method does work well for Face Up and Mojo. Also, what is fun is to literally taste the coffee in a very different way. I think this is always quite enjoyable. 15 grams here, and I'm going to do the exact same recipe. I have lowered my temperature to 90 degrees Celsius. So I'm going to actually keep that bloom the same. Trying to do that 60-gram bloom. Pouring, quite slow. And the biggest difference that's going to happen here is I'm just going to do a really, really slow pour all the way up to 270, 285 type of world. But I'm not going to try to slow the drawdown time at the end there with the swirl and the tap. This one, I think you can just let the water drain through and let the ratio really kind of speak for itself. And this is where having something like the Cafec Tsubame is very helpful. But I like to just do pretty slow-ish pours here. And I would really say, like, these coffees are gonna taste good, that you don't have to be crazy about how your bed actually looks. I'd really say the agitation is what matters here, or like the flow rate you're pouring at is what matters here. It is more effort, I will say. But I think this is a very fun, different way of presenting these coffees. And I wanted to talk about a different way to brew them. So I'm actually going to push this guy up to 280. And you just don't touch this. Just let this drain down. So yeah, that's how you do it. More effort than the first one because you actually have to pour water for a very, very long period of time. I'm trying to pour even slower with the second method because I still want to maintain the taste of the coffee, if that makes sense. So there we go. Because I went coarser, the brew time can actually even be shorter, but it's really this ratio that we're going to taste that is going to push up that extraction to a point that could be a little not tasting so good. Like it could be a little too much for some of these coffees. Obviously, you're getting more liquid with the second brew. This should be significantly more transparent, which will allow you to taste the profile a lot more, very similar to how you would when you actually cup these. But that lower temperature, lower agitation is going to really, really try to clean things up. It's going to really try to round things up and bring out sweetness to compensate for that significantly larger ratio. I also wouldn't do this with some grinders. Like some grinders, when you push them out to this ratio, it just doesn't taste good. And then at that point, you're like, is it the coffee? Is it the grinder? Is it my brewing methods? So I would say try the second recipe at your own risk. But I like these coffees a lot in these two methods. So this second brew is much more thinner. It is that large, high extraction style of coffee, but you're able to taste very minutely how the profile is changing, like how these roasting profiles, how the acidity is being manipulated by the roast profile. I don't think the second method of brewing is as enjoyable. Like it doesn't, to me, it doesn't make as tasty as a cup as the first method. But the second method is like a great way to just, if you're curious about how these profiles, what these profiles are actually doing and how things change in the cup, this second method, could be quite interesting in that sense. It's kind of like thin to a point that it could be uninteresting for a lot of people, but you are able to kind of really taste the acidity and taste like the dynamics and taste how things adjust in the cup. This first one is still much more enjoyable to me. It's brighter, it's still sweet, it fits the style of the coffees, and this is, much more, I would say, a normal pouring structure. It's just low agitation and let the coffees carry you. The second method is just transparency, which is good and bad with some of these coffees. So yeah, just wanted to provide you guys this bigger overall structure video on how to handle a lot of the Asia roasting profile coffees. I think it's very fun to try all of our coffees on both pouring structures, but I would really recommend you brew Momokawa, Mute, Desolate on the first recipe. I think Face Up and Mojo work pretty okay on the second recipe. I tend to actually really enjoy Mute and Desolate on that first recipe. The second recipe, where you're really going for that transparency vibe, I think Mojo and Face Up work really well because those coffees are light enough, they're bright enough that, and they're clean, that they work really well in that transparent form. I think it's just fun to experiment regardless, but this is kind of that overall structure on how to brew our coffees on pour over. What I would recommend, just thought processes. Of course, feel free to take these methods and try applying them to other coffees. I think they work well for a bunch of different coffees. But again, we're gonna move a lot of this content on Asia Roasting Project to the actual channel. We're having a bunch of videos from our roasters that's going to be on that channel as well. And again, we're running 10% off on Mojo for the holidays. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for spending time to watch this video. Thanks everyone for picking up the coffees. I'm so happy to be working with all these roasters, releasing all these different coffees. Mojo is the final one for the year. We might do something for holiday. Who knows? We'll see. But thank you so much for, again, picking up the coffees and watching this video. I hope this general brew guide, thought process on how to brew our coffees is helpful, but I'll see you guys later.